what sport if you put on your kind of hockey coaching lens, what would be another sport that you enjoy watching and maybe stealing some ideas from?
Probably football, I guess, would be the quick one to come to mind. But there's so many great coaches. I like to read, and I read a lot in the summertime. And basketball coaches have a ton of great stuff. It seems and feels like they deal with dynamics that we do as hockey coaches. I don't know if it's size of the team or style of play, system of play, but so over the years, Phil Jackson, John Wood, Pat Riley, those things. But football, I enjoy watching because it's set plays and they practice. They only play 16, 17, 18 games. College, obviously, less. So it's so intense. Every game is so intense. Every possession is so intense. I enjoy that component of it and the demand on coaching from that component. I remember when I was coaching with the St. Louis Blues as an assistant, we did a visit to the Rams, St. Louis Rams at the time, NFL team.
Was Fisher the coach?
Coach's room. He was not. A coach, it slips me now, but a historic older coach. And when we did a tour of the facility, you walk in his office and you look at his desk and everything else, and then you realize as you walk closer to the desk, there's a room to the side with a king size or queen size bed.
Come on.
And that brings it to life. How they just sleep at the office. Because, again, 17 or 18 games, you can't afford to make mistakes. College football is even more intense. You lose a game or two, you're out of the contention now. And then everything's a set play. And I marvel at when you look at the mistakes made in an NFL game, especially when it comes down to the wire, and you think of the amount of time they've had to practice. Now, I know there's volumes of set plays, but the number of mistakes has got to be awful for a coach and the coaching staffs. And you see it every game. And it's a lot has to do with pressure and pressure in the moment. And I think it's fascinating to watch, knowing how intense those coaches are and intent they've been on, drilling and repping stuff, and they still make errors. Our sport in hockey is just free flowing, and you're obviously going to make a ton more errors that way. And we just get hammered on it, with the errors made, and it exhausts us as coaches to try to, play this imaginary perfect game, which is pretty much impossible unless you're, an NHL team playing a bunch of, peewee hockey players, which we know is not the case. There's going to be lots and lots of mistakes.
Well, it's interesting. Kyle Okposo described your practices in Buffalo as a little less structured and more hockey realistic. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I guess you have to think about that one, but I would hope he meant that it's more game-like. My approach, especially here and when I was in Buffalo, should I say here because I still live in Buffalo, was play at replicate a game pace, replicate some of the chaos in the game, quick sorts and quick transition from offense to defense, vice versa. So a lot of the drills that we would put in would be to push that pace and rep those situations at a game-like pace. And number one for me, tied in with that, I mean, that's a number one component there, but tied in with that would be player enjoyment. The players, it's not easy to practice in the NHL from the standpoint, lots of different standpoints, but one standpoint is you usually played a game the night before, or if you didn't play a game the night before, you probably play a game the next night. One of those two scenarios. So your players are already thinking, well, we played last night. I'm a little tired. Or we play tomorrow. I don't need a high pace, high tempo. I got to get ready for the game tomorrow. So you're usually in one of those situations. And what I mean by that is you really only have probably 10 to 12 practice days a year where you're not in that situation, where you didn't play the night before and you didn't play where in the American League, you get 4 of those a week, or 3 or 4 of those a week. You've got 10 to 12 the whole season. So you have to make it, in my opinion, make it you want player engagement, and for player and people engagement, you got to make it, intriguing and fun. Um, so we tried to make it dynamic and make sure. I remember going back to the national team program from, having NHL experience as an assistant coach and AHL experience for years of dealing with pro players, and just experimenting with different drills and saying, after practicing, well, that drill probably wouldn't work at the NHL level. We probably wouldn't keep their attention or excite them about the practice itself, or the drill itself. So when I did get my job as a head coach in Buffalo, I had already pretty much gone through hundreds and hundreds of drills with that in mind. What would work to excite a player in the NHL? Because the context is they're not that excited when they came to the rink because they're probably worn out and beat up. And we all know it. An 82 game schedule, everybody will say it. It's a grind and it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. So, asking your guys to do sprints within a marathon is not necessarily conducive. You have to manage your energy and you have to pick your spots.
Yeah.
And guys tend to go a lot harder for things and fight a lot harder when they're having fun. So, that's the underlying philosophy in it. So back to what Kyle had mentioned, the goal was to make it game like, more game like, and the players to actually feel and identify that, wow, this is a game like situation. This is fun. I feel like I'm getting better here.
And I think it was said very much in the context of a compliment. I think there's a really valuable lesson here, though, when you talk about experimenting with drills, and just throughout your career, how intentional have you been about just experimenting with drills and maybe just reflecting on practices, and if so, how have you kept track of that in terms of like, here's a drill I think that I might use down the road if I'm in the National Hockey League, or here's a drill that I think that, well, there could be 5 different drills to teach this, system or specific details. This is the one that I think is I'm going to stick with because of the player engagement.
Well, it's you mentioned the word intentional. You said a lot there, so I actually wrote a couple notes to make sure I hit what you've asked. But you it's everything I do is there should be intent to it.
Yeah.
You have a vision of what you want as a coach. Um, so you're going to be intentional about that, and you got to know. When I look at being a head coach, there's so many different dynamics, and for me, my goal was to coach at the highest level, and that's the NHL. Not just because I wanted to be in the NHL as a head coach. It's just I'm a competitive person, and that's the highest level, and that's where
Yeah.
I want to go. You want to be the best and challenge yourself to be the best. So there was a lot of intent from day one when I started coaching. It was tough for me to quit playing and go into coaching. And I was sacrificing something I love a lot. So I said, with intent, I'm doing it because someone's offered me a pretty good job and I do want to stay in the game. So I had intent right from day one about making it as a coach. And then obviously, even in the NHL, it's not a conducive environment for experimenting, but you have to experiment every single day in the NHL. So you better know what. So you really got to have a good feel of how extreme or not you can be in any given situation. What are you afforded to? When you have an opportunity to experiment, you should. A simple example: someone on listen to someone on XM radio. They're talking about pulling the goalie. And somebody posed the thing that, well, even if you're down 2 goals and you pull the goalie, you're at least, the worst case scenario, going to get some video on your guys with the goalie pulled. So
Yeah.
it may be, you think of, okay, the number one thing is you're trying to score goals and win a game. The secondary of it is, we haven't been in the situation in 3 weeks. We need a little video now that this player's back in the lineup or that player's back in the lineup. So, worst case scenario, we get a minute and a half of video, which is very impactful. The next game, if we're down a goal tomorrow night, I know we're down 2 goals. I know we're down 3 goals, but that might be an example of a moment that you can experiment within the context of coaching in the NHL. So you have to, again, you have to know where you want to go as a coach, as a head coach, where you want your team to go. And then, you're intentionally experimenting with how to get to that point and faster. And that's really, you need to develop your team, and you're trying to develop it faster. And all of this you're taking in, everything is in context text. So I always would say, to coaches you talk to, well, you can have a 200-page coaching manual laid out at the start of the year, but there's no context. Think about the preseason predictions of the NHL. There's no
Totally.
context. You don't know how good you are compared to the next opponent and all the moves they made. And once, so you can have that 200-page manual and you can do a perfect job with it, but you've got to read and react as soon as the puck drops in day one. So your resources are the experience you gained as a head coach, and obviously your knowledge and savvy, whatever you want to call it, as a head coach, from the moment the season starts, because now you have context every day that you have to evaluate and reevaluate every day. And on day two, the context might be you lost two guys to injury. So what do we do now? And again, you're relying on your experience to help you with the best case decision in that instance.
It's interesting kind of going back to the football examples. I know when you hear players talk about Bill Belichick, New England Patriots, he sort of constructed practice like very much situational football, but trying to expose the players to as many things as possible. Maybe not having that mindset that, hey, practice has to be perfect, but kind of with the end goal in mind and saying our goals to be the best team possible when it counts at the end of the year. It is part of the mindset that all coaches should look to adopt, is that you know and it's funny, like I've learned a lot about this from just our world of the coaches site, being kind of evolving into a technology company, and all the advice that I've got is that sometimes when you experiment, if it doesn't work, it's not a failure. It's valuable because you learned what doesn't work. So it's part of that mindset. And some people might define that as a growth mindset, but just knowing as a coach that, hey, just because you do a drill and it doesn't work out doesn't mean you failed or was a bad practice. It's just an opportunity for you to learn and know how you adjust moving forward.
I agree completely. You have to experiment again, because you want to stay cutting edge. You want to advance your team. You want to better your situation. So, it's I guess the more experience you have, the better educated you are on what to
Totally.
experience, what to experiment with and when. But I would not fear failure one bit. I think you be upfront, you be honest with your players. You even tell them, hey, we're going to try this. Let's see. And here's what I'm thinking about in the context of why we're going to try this today. I would go into our practices and say, hey, we're going to try a new drill based on video I've watched. And here's a couple of clips, and here's us doing this. We're in this situation in a game multiple times, especially against the team we're playing next. Here's a couple of clips of the situation. Here's a couple of clips of the key points in it, and here's a drill we're going to do to replicate it today. And you usually get real good response and buy-in by your players. What
Love
I
that.
found is your players, if they know the purpose behind the drill, they're engaged in it. If they don't, and it's a new or different drill, it's sometimes really difficult, challenging for them. One of your questions you asked a moment ago that I didn't answer was with the drills. I've always kept a database long ago, and I think most coaches now, because there's software and computers are so advanced now compared to 20 years ago with this stuff. I think most coaches have it and can keep a database of their drills and their coaching notes and their meetings. I found that extremely valuable. But yes, I would have the diagram of the drill and notes even after practice. I'd write them on my sheet and then put them in the computer later if I needed to. And that's really helpful going back to things. And then I think you mentioned something about perfect practices. When you practice and you practice to be perfect, your team tends to panic and recognizes when they screw up and then identifies it.
Yeah.
So I do feel you need some chaos and the ability to handle chaos, because it's a flow game. Our sport is a flow game, and you can't let mishaps and hiccups bog you down. And so while I do you do practice set plays off face-offs, or recognizing we're in a set situation. Maybe it's a line change. That's really a set situation. You get guys going to the bench and guys coming off the bench. Those are things where, yeah, you could look at, okay, here's the routes we want, or more more perfection in there, and less conceptual, where conceptual would be fill the middle or allow our D to keep a tight gap. You're talking conceptually there and different tactics you'd use. Um, so yeah, most of our practices that I like to run are, flow of the game in chaos and quick sorts and skill. Um, you know, if that makes sense, I guess.
Can you give any examples of, maybe how you would define the chaos that you would be comfortable with? Perhaps even just using an example of a drill.
Well, I guess a tricky part is, if you run just 5-on-5 drill or compete drill, as a coach, it's tricky because when the offense does something good, it means your defense did something bad and allowed
Yeah,
that,
great point. Great point.
and vice versa. So,
Yeah,
so I'm the guy that always comes off the ice and says, I didn't like that practice because you remember, the things you didn't like. So if you want to run high tempo stuff, you probably can't blow the whistle and have the guys do push-ups if they botch a pass, because you almost have to turn a blind eye to some things when you're stressing one thing. So if you're stressing the offensive side of it, you're excited that they executed offensively, and you almost have to hold your breath because you didn't execute the way you needed to defensively. And I've always found that's a really difficult thing as a head coach. But again, when you put it in the context of, okay, what does our team need? Our team needs transition speed, so we're gonna work on transition speed. And I know, we're probably going to have a benefit defensively against teams that want to transition speed because we're getting reps. But I don't want to stop the drill and overbear it with defense, because now we're not going to transition fast anymore in this practice. So,
yeah.
I found you're always balancing that as a head coach. As you work on one thing, you're gonna there's things that are going to aggravate you all the time, especially with young and developing teams. That ones that I've had experience with. That I can tell you that's my experience from working with teams like that are young.
So, I mean, you've worked at a variety of levels. You've worked with so many talented players. Arguably, um, you know, the collection of talent that you would have had at the U.S. National Development Team program really stands out. How much does that experience working with these, um, uber talented kids in their formative years help you flex your patience muscle when it comes to player development?
Well, it helped. It helped for sure. But I do believe coaching is so different today. You have to finesse as a head coach today. You don't have a hammer. 20 years ago, you had a hammer. You listen to me or else. And kids were brought up. You and I were brought up, and you were brought up to respect authority. You listen to the coach. You listen to your teacher. And kids these days don't understand that concept. It's you don't outright trust a coach. You don't outright trust a teacher. You don't, you got to look after yourself. It's a totally different. So we're coaching players now that weren't brought up how we were. And so it's a finesse. Like I say, you don't have the hammer you did as a coach 20 years ago. So it is a finesse situation. So you have to have patience. You have to have tact. You have to be better, more tactful, and you have to enlist your staff and people, and you have to listen. And I found you gotta get people feeling good and the psyche in order if you really want to be your best. And people are different today, so that's a different method to get to that point. You didn't usually have to get to that work to that point to get the psyche in order, but you do today. It seems for most part. But yes, the development team and working with them. What I found, I went into that situation where I spent 5 years at the national team
Yeah,
program, and I had 3 different birth years and lots of prolific talent. And if you think about it, we picked those players out of bantam hockey. They're bantam age
yeah,
hockey players. And then we're going to plug them in the USHL, which is up to 20, 21 years old the next year. So they're 15-year-old players playing against 20-year-old players, 15 turning 16.
yeah.
And so they're giving up size, strength, knowledge, competitiveness. I always said it's kryptonite to them, where they came in with these superpowers. They dominated their youth hockey days, scoring, at will and imposing their will on the game. They didn't have to pay attention to a coach because they just
Yeah.
went. If they were the guy that gave up the goal to go down 1-0 with 5 minutes left, the coach looked at him and said, "You got to get back out there. We need a goal again." I can't
Totally.
bench you.
Yeah, great
You know,
point.
so you're working with that type of player that never had to go up and down the rink knowing a system of hockey or using players on his flank or working together to get a puck back. They just, again, imposed their physical will or their skill on the game and got the puck back. So now you take the national team players and you throw them in the USHL the first year as U17s, and then the next year, the kryptonite for them is NCAA Division One, where players are some are 25 years old, and they have to learn the game itself. They have to recognize situations within the game, and they have to learn how to use their teammate as primary. Then their skill, if once they learn that, then their skill comes back. And it's not, they can't impose their will on the game, but they can impose their will on situations within the game. Now they have to learn when is the right situation to impose my will. And I'll flip it real easy visual is a player would get 20 shifts in a game. And if you ask them, what's your objective when you hop over the boards? And well, let's just think of forward specifically. What do you think their objective is? If we think about it, they're probably going to tell you score a goal. My objective is to score a goal. And I would, challenge everybody to think, okay, so I get 20 shifts a game. My objective is to score a goal. Has anybody seen somebody score 20 goals? No. So meaning you when you jump over the boards, if all you're doing is trying to score a goal, you can no longer read a play. How about you jump over the boards and the goal is to read a play? And when and then you're learning to discern what situation when it presents itself that now we can score a goal. And if you think about the best players in the game, as I think right now, Pasternak, Kucherov, Austin Matthews, Nylander, Marner, they recognize, there's no goal to be scored right now. So I'm just going to soft chip the puck in and line change. But the next moment, holy cow, there's a goal to be scored here. I'm going to pounce on this puck and I'm going to attack right now. So they discern that. And so, when you have the talent coming into the national team program, they're raw. They don't know how to play together. They don't know how to move up and down the rink together. They don't know how to system. So you learn as a coach, you can challenge yourself and say, okay, how do I implement systems fast? How do I get this group of talent? Now, is it running drills? Is it a dry marker board meeting? Is it a one-on-one meeting? Is it a video session? Those are all your tools as a coach that you have access to. So I went again into the national team program with years of hindsight, AHL, NHL, and I said, what I'm going to do is challenge myself. How can I speed this process up for these talented players? Because I saw lots of players that were first round picks in the American Hockey League. I had 6 Hobey Baker winners while I was coaching in the American Hockey League. So clearly talented enough players. And I only say this because it's the barometer. They're talented enough players to play in the NHL, but they're not in the NHL. I'm coaching them in the American League. So what's missing? And it's a lot of the things that I just said. It's the ability to seize the moment in the NHL, to carve out a spot for yourself. So now I get all this talent with that hindsight and going to the national team program. So for me, the experiment for me was, how do I teach these players or get these players to play together? And then how do I speed that process? And again, my tools are video sessions, dry marker board meetings, one-on-one meetings, and obviously your drills and practice. And so every day I'm tweaking all of that to speed that process. And I feel we got better. The first birth year I had was the 95s, and you had, JT Compher, Tyler Mott come to mind in that group.
Yeah.
The next birth year was the 97s, and there's no question in my mind I was a better coach, and our staff were better coaches. Had the same assistant coach back, and that birth year was prolific. It was Austin Matthews, Matthew Kachuk, and Roslovic, and on and on. Greenway, Cunnin, Hanifin, Werenski, just
Wild.
just wild. McAvoy, just wild group, and more. I'm missing more that are in the NHL. And we absolutely got better coaching that in that situation.
How do you teach players to read the play?
Yeah, this makes me think of we think as coaches and people we're dealing with reality, right? It's face value. We're dealing with reality, but we're not. We're dealing with the perception of reality. It's not reality. It's the perception of it. And what I mean to go further is, we have this hypothetical player, and you know, we think the reality is he missed the play, and that is, it's an actuality. That's what happened. But you got to pull him aside and say, what did you see? Well, I thought I was under pressure. So that's a perception. The reality is you were not under pressure. You got rid of the puck too soon. And so my point is, you need to get the perception of the players. What are they thinking, seeing, feeling in this situation before you even start to tell them something? So when I have a guy and I'm doing video and I say, I got to work on this guy, his awareness or situational awareness, or he's not reading the play. You pull him in and I say, okay, here's a clip. Tell me what you see and feel in this situation. So now I know his reality. This is what he's feeling. I don't have any support. So that would be that's his perception of it. I might say, well, you don't need support in this situation because nobody's pressuring you. So, you need to get, I found you, and especially today, this is more so today than ever. When you're working with somebody, you need to get how they're perceiving things, how they see things, if you're going to help them advance, if that makes
Which
sense.
I think is and I think that's a great point, because I think it's so intuitive as a coach to try and help the player see it through your top down lens of watching video and saying, this is what was happening. But as we all know, like, the view of the game changes dramatically from the nosebleeds to when you're down at ice level. And I think what you're trying to say is, as a coach, there's value in trying to see the game through the player's lens and work from that point and help them adapt versus trying to interpret things from the view that you get, say on video from the bench.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's one reason for that too, beyond what you're saying, is sometimes you ask the player and you're like, well, coach, did you see it hit the linesman's skate there? And you're like, no, I didn't see that. And then sure
Yeah,
enough, it's right in the video. And so you do
yeah,
need to get that feedback so you don't look, you know, a little bit goofy when you're explaining something, and then he tells you after the fact. So that's happened to me over the years, right? You
100%. That's
explain
happened to
something,
everybody. Yeah,
and they're like, "Coach, didn't you see it hit the skate?" And you're like, "Oh, I guess never mind what I said." So now I see it, So you do have to take that. But I guess when you're in those situations as a coach, you know what you see and you know what you want. Okay, so I'm not changing what you see as a coach and what you want, but we really need to get the player to do that and see that. So the first step in moving him in that direction is learning what he's thinking and perceiving. Like I said, his perception. What is he perceiving? And again, he might be perceiving he's under pressure. So you're going to have to deal with that first before he's going to be able to think about you. How do you deal with this pressure? And then you can work your way toward getting what you want, or the objective of having the meeting in the first place. Um, so again, there's the finesse I talk about or spoke of earlier in any given situation, coaching wise. It's not that it's not a negotiation. It might feel like it, but it's not. You're not going to have to compromise as a coach, but you're going to have to help your player understand the objective that you want to hit as a coach, and why. And if you can't get that across to the player, you better work on your coaching. My quick thought on it is. So,
yeah.
yeah,
No,
that's how I go about it.
it's it's well said. It just, as you're saying that too, it brings me back. There's been a lot written recently about Jaden Daniels, the quarterback for the Washington Commanders, and his adoption of virtual reality. And obviously different sports, but from what is described is that he effectively puts on a headset, and it mimics what's going on in the pocket, or the pocket, and how he makes reads. But effectively, the goal is to get him comfortable with that extra second of time, to allow him to process 1 second longer to make the right play, and that takes, that's not one conversation, it's not one rep. Like, that's over time to get players comfortable with hanging onto the ball, perhaps hanging on with the puck, and letting those plays develop. You mentioned that the 6 Hobie Baker winners that you coached in the American Hockey League. And we just touched on you listed off some of the names of the players that you had at the NDP program, which was phenomenal. But a couple players that stand out to me that maybe are a little less heralded, like um, part of this, I think it's because I'm based in Vancouver. I could watch Kiefer Sherwood play hockey all day. He's been amazing here. Dakota Joshua, another kid, and you mentioned Tyler Mott, and as you said, all these players that took part in that program were superstars in youth hockey. And there's also a lot of those players that surprise me. You go back and look at the list that maybe didn't make it, but I want to focus on these players that maybe my sense is they really had to reinvent their game to find a place in pro hockey. Like they, as much as they were tagged early as top prospects, all three of those players had to, round all the bases to eventually carve out a role in the National Hockey League. Can you maybe just touch on how you help players, adapt, and maybe what are some of the skills that they had to acquire to realize that dream of playing in the NHL?
Yeah, I think the quick part of it to me is they had enough skills. Now it's a matter of, okay, how are you going to get a roster spot?
Yeah,
You're because sometimes players, they score 50 goals in youth hockey, so they think they're going to take Patrick Kane's spot on the power play. You're probably not going to do that, upon entry in the NHL level, because you're even though you're skilled, you're not that skilled, if that makes sense. So your role is not going to be a first line or second line winger when you enter the NHL. The coach is going to say, I don't know you, first of all. I'm unfamiliar with you as a hockey player. And that's how you enter when you enter the NHL, the head coach in the NHL is trying to win the game. And he's not familiar with you as a player unless you've gone through multiple training camps and he actually spent deliberate time to get to know you.
and probably
So
doesn't give a shit what you did in Bantam.
And he doesn't. It's irrelevant. So it's irrelevant, and you don't know, and you really don't, for any reason, you have no reason to care, really, because
Yeah,
it's not helpful. So again, to me, I've always educated players that way. How are you going? I put up, there's plenty of stuff on YouTube of me putting up an NHL depth chart
yeah,
and saying, how are you going to knock one of these guys out? Because if you think about kids and people and parents today, it's all the birth year. Oh, my kid, I know where he fits in the birth year, and the birth year, and the birth year. In the NHL, there's 25 birth years.
yeah,
So, your confidence is, oh, I'm this good in my birth year. Well, that's great because there's 25 birth years in the NHL. So, so again, how are you going to earn the coach's trust? And he's going to designate he's going to designate a slot for you, a third line or fourth line winger or center or 50, sixth defenseman. And you're going to have to know how you're going to be evaluated in that slot and what that team expects or coach expects of you. And you're going to have to prove that you can do it. And when you prove that you can do it, he's going to give you more ice time because he's going to say, you know what? When a coach puts guys on the ice, he wants predictability. He wants to know what he's going to get. It's your responsibility as a player to gain the trust of your coach. And to do that, you've got to be responsible, but you got to know what you're responsible for. So it's an education. There's lots of, again, back to the Hobey Baker winners in the NHL, there's lots of talent not in the NHL. To be in the NHL, you got to know how to seize the moment. And again, it might be your first game in the NHL and you're going to get 6 minutes of ice time. Well, to get another game in the NHL, you're going to have to do really well, probably not get scored on, and probably be hard to play against. And then the coach can say, you know what? I kind of like this kid. I don't feel vulnerable when he's on the ice, so I'm going to give him 8 minutes tomorrow. And then he gets 8 minutes, and it's the same thing. And the coach is like, send this kid down. Are you crazy? We're keeping this kid. I'll fight for this kid because I can put him on the ice. He's helping me win a game, or he's helping us diminish when we're vulnerable. And then you look at the players like Dakota Joshua, he's in your face, or Sherwood. You see them not only, playing a safe game, but they're impacting the game. They're pressuring pucks. They're frustrating the other team. They're causing a diversion away from your talented players and buying them, creating more room or space or time for them. And,
Yeah.
they skate by the visiting bench and the whole bench is yapping at them. And you think about it, the pre-scout before the game was go after Quinn Hughes. Now the bench isn't even worried about Quinn Hughes. They want to kill Sherwood or, Dakota Joshua. This is a beautiful thing if you're a coach on the bench. So
And I
those
love that you
players,
haven't mentioned goal scoring at all in the last 2 minutes.
no, it's impacting
Yeah.
winning. That's
Yeah.
how you're going to get to the NHL upon entry, typically. And then when you prove that then you can prove to your coach you're a little bit more and a little bit more. But you have to learn how to not be a liability first, or not be a liability first. Connor Clifton's another good example for me. Um, when they were drafting him, he drafted by Arizona. I got a call from and I was coaching him at the NTDP and at the time, and a call from the draft table, and they said, they asked, should give me again why we should draft him right here. And one of the things I mentioned real quick was I said, and there's a certain type of player that will or won't persevere. Some players think I'm super talented and I'm not getting the opportunity, so they withdraw effort and they don't even know they're withdrawing effort, the subconscious level. It's just happening, right? They feel bad, they pity the people, people around them. Their support is, yeah, you're getting screwed or you're not this or that, and they just gradually lose. They drop it down, and I remember that call. I'm sitting in the stands at the draft, and it's a call from the draft table, and I said, "You absolutely should draft Connor Clifton." And I said, he's the type of player that's going to need some time in the American League, but he doesn't care. Doesn't care that he's in the American League. It's not an insult to him. He's going to go to the American League and say, I am going to compete like hell and be ready for whenever I get called up. He's going to fight and scratch and claw and survive. He's not looking for a quick fix and a reward. Now, there's other players that I think when you draft later in the draft, you need to find that out because they're probably going to spend time in the American Hockey League. Do they have it in their fiber to persevere and fight and scratch and claw while they're in the American League, or is it going to be a pity party? And really important, if I'm a scout and I'm an NHL team, I'm looking at that with any pick any pick that's going to spend time in the American League. It's a different league, and it takes a different person in makeup. So if you're that super talented guy that's never had to fight through adversity, that's a whole lot of adversity when you end up in the American League and guys are running you into the glass every day.
And you're competing with your teammates for that opportunity, which I think is so unique. You mentioned some of the clips of you on YouTube. I encourage everybody that's listening, go do a YouTube search on Don Granato. There's some absolute gold. Um, One talk in particular, I believe it was put out by USA Hockey. It wasn't to the NDP program kids. I think it was one of the USA Hockey festivals, and you talked about work ethic. And so when you're addressing the kids, you're like, okay, how many kids want to play how many of you want to play in the NHL? Of course, all the hands go up. And then, and you say, like, how many of you work hard? Like, all the hands go up. And, you talked about not so much outworking the other person, but finding a way to outwork the other person. And I think there's a real, at least how I interpreted it, that there's a real distinction there. Like, anybody can get on the hamster wheel or the treadmill and go as hard as long as possible, but perhaps a bit of a different mindset to say, I'm going to scan the room and figure out the thing that I can do that not only maybe where I outwork the other person, but I find a way to stand out and, as you say, contribute more to winning. And I think that there's maybe a bit of a savviness or intellect that some of the players you just mentioned have to figure that out.
I would agree. And if I think about the players you mentioned, the players I had a lot. I only had Kiefer Sherwood for a very short time, but he did what he's doing in Vancouver. He
He's
came in,
dynamite.
yeah, he was phenomenal. Used his speed, his grit, passion for the game. But I think of guys like Tyler Mott or JT Compher, and they were not. They didn't have the skill set of Austin Matthews, um, Clayton Keller, Jack Eichel, players I had in that category. And I'll slide back to the Mott category or Comfer, Matthew Tkachuk. So these are guys that entered the league and said, okay, what is my skill set? And then what are the situations when I can impress that skill set, imprint that skill set in the game? Matthew Tkachuk is an absolute master at that because if he tried to race up and down the rink and play a super skilled game, he wouldn't be a good hockey player. He knows how to not be a liability and move up and down the rink and not be a liability, be responsible, and then in the moment when he has the edge on the other team, he pounces on it, and you see massive skill. But you don't see him carrying and lugging a puck up the ice and doing fancy plays. But in a small confined area around the net or goal line or entry, you see this massive amount of skill. So his situational awareness of in the context of the skill he has, he knows, okay, these are the moments I can make an impact on the game with my skill. My skill's not up and down the rink like Connor McDavid, so I'm not going to try to do that. And for Matthew, I think he had way more opportunity when he entered the NTDP. He dominated Bantam hockey, and I challenged him a lot, and he was intuitive enough to figure out, okay, I could do that at the Bantam level. I'm probably not going to be able to do that the rest of the way. And a quick example was he exposed a lot of pucks as a youth hockey player, and he toe dragged a lot of guys. And so he tried to do that from the defensive zone out and through the neutral zone. And you don't see him do any of that at this point. So he was smart enough, intuitive enough to alter his game based on his skill set and the situations he was going to be in. And I think all of those players that make such an impact that you mentioned have done that and adjusted their game. I don't think that super talented Connor McDavids and Matthews, they have to adjust their game less, right? They can just impose their will on it. So it's learning, that, hey, you're a pretty damn good hockey player, but you can only impose your will in certain situations. So learning what those are.
Yeah, I mean, listen, whether it's being a hockey player, being a hockey coach, or frankly, finding success in any walk of life, at least through my experience, I think so much of it is just reflection and self awareness, and doing what you do. I think everybody has that Matthew Tkachuk story of saying, you know what, knowing what you can and can't do, and playing to your strengths is so much a part of that recipe. Um, can we go back to Downers Grove, which, by the way, sounds like a sitcom town? I had to make sure I got it right when I was looking up.
Yeah, lots of good memories there.
Is it true you used to be a goalie?
It is, yeah. I was a goalie until I was a goalie as a freshman in high school, and then I made the switch.
Okay, so that statement is even more remarkable when you consider that you went on to captain the University of Wisconsin hockey team as a forward. Um, However, I understand that part of the process in making that switch. I don't know if it was for Christmas or your birthday, but you asked for a VCR so you could analyze NHL game tape and teach yourself how to play forward.
You did a lot of research, boy. That's pretty good, Aaron. Yes, that is exactly right. So I was, I guess I was a pretty good goalie, but it was youth hockey. So let's keep it in context there. But when I just wanted to play, I wanted to skate, I wanted to score, and I thought, you know what, I'm making a switch, and it was predicated on this. This is what happened. My second year Bantam, we was the first team I was on where we had two goalies. So before that, I got to play every day. I was happy. Now the coach said, we're going to alternate you and Joey Nillis every other night, every other game. Well, now I'm sitting on the bench watching my team play for 30 games, every other game as we rotate. And that drove me crazy to sit on a bench and watch other people play hockey. So about 2 months in, I begged the coach. I said, coach, if Joey's playing, can I at least put on forward gear and play instead of sitting on the bench? He's like, no, you can't do that. In hindsight now, I think other parents might have complained, now he's getting ice time up front. Who knows, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
it wasn't until a Christmas tournament that year that we had enough injuries. And the coach said, hey, tomorrow, we're short players. So if you want to play forward, you can play forward. So I had extra forward gear. Older brother, and I got Tony's hand me downs, and so I bring forward gear to the game the next day, and I played. I think I had a hat trick that game. If I didn't,
No
I
way.
did well. I did well enough that he said after the game, "You can play anytime you want when Joey's in the net." So I
Yeah.
finished the year and played 20 games up front that year, and did really well. Two of my best friends on the team, we ended up 1, 2, and 3 in scoring by the end of the year, and that was all the confidence I needed and reassurance. I said, "That's it. I'm making a switch. This is too much fun going up and down the rink." And at that point, I was sick of Tony shooting pucks at my collarbones and everything else. You had nothing but foam padding as a goalie. So I was ready. I was ready to make that move. And I knew somehow, some way, intuitively, I knew the commitment I was making. And it might have been because Tony was mad at me. I was switching, my older brother,
Yeah.
and my dad wasn't too happy with me that I was switching.
Because you
So
probably bought all that gear.
lots of people tried to talk me out of switching from goalie.
Yeah.
And so that stoked the fire even more. And I remember that. I'm like, well, if you guys don't think I can do it, well, I'll show you. And so I knew intuitively that, okay, this is a massive commitment. And, I asked for a VCR. I would rewind every zone entry and every skill play that I could see and say, okay, what mechanically was happening? What was the situation that provided opportunity for this? And so that was really my first coaching job. Was I had to coach myself and
Wow.
develop myself. And I was lucky because that summer, Aaron, Tony was drafted by the New York Rangers,
Yeah.
and Herb Brooks and the guy that drafted Tony, the head scout of the New York Rangers, was a guy named Chuck Grillo, and
Yes. Chuck Grill hockey camps.
they had Minnesota hockey camps,
Yeah.
and they invited Tony and our whole family up there because they just drafted him. So we all
Can
went
I
up
can
there.
I pause right? Can I pause right there? Not to
Sure,
interrupt,
sure.
but there's mom and dad, 6 kids, right?
6 of us, yeah.
What was the family vehicle?
It was a big van, a big
I bet it was
conversion van that fit like 10 people.
hilarious. Okay, so you're heading north to Minnesota hockey camps.
So we go to Minnesota hockey camps. I go there. It's the first time I'm officially a forward, not a goalie. Sign up as a forward, spend the week there. It's literally on a campsite. So there's little cabins, and one of the cabins was the office that Chuck Grillo had. So we pull the van out to the front office to say goodbye and thank you for the week. And I remember I literally have my bag that I walked from the dorms to meet my parents up there, and I dropped my bag and my sticks are right next to me. And the camp director, Chuck Grillo, says, how did the kids like it? And my dad's reply, I remember it clear as day. They loved it. And Donnie does not want to go home. And he looked at my dad and he said, well, he doesn't have to go home. I'll put him to work and he can skate every day. And I can remember picking up my sticks and I'm like, I'm staying. So I stayed for like the next, I don't know, 6, 7 weeks. And then every summer after that. And so he made me a counselor of 10 and 12-year-old kids that summer. And I could go on the ice after they finished the day. So I skated every day with the practice sessions and then on my own. And then I did the same the next 3, 4 summers. And I did when I made that change to forward, I had the goal right then is I want to play at the University of Wisconsin, but I knew the school was so damn good. There's no way you could go there unless you're on a scholarship. And for me, my goal was I need a full scholarship if I'm going to go to Wisconsin. Otherwise, you're probably not good enough.
Because Tony would have been, what is he, 3, 4 years older than you, your senior?
Tony's 3 years older. So
Yeah.
when I made the switch, or I was a goalie, my last year at goalie,
Yeah.
Tony was at Northwood Prep in Lake Placid. He committed to Wisconsin, and Bob Johnson was the coach. It was Bob Johnson's last year. My parents
Yeah.
threw us in that van and said, let's go. We're going to go up to Madison, Wisconsin, and watch the university where Tony's committed to going next year. And I sat at that game and watched that game with 8,000 people in the building. And I thought, I want to play here and I want to score a goal in this building. It's amazing. And that inspired me as well.
it's obvious and maybe doesn't need to be pointed out, but in a world today where you can go on YouTube and you can get these campus tours and you can see everything before you see it. I can just imagine the experience of being a young kid and walking onto campus for the first time, being in the game atmosphere for the first time. This is an odd example, but um, my dad has a story when he saw Michael Jackson in the early 80s at a concert, and when he tells the story to me, he's like, you got to remember, he's like, I had never seen Michael Jackson before. We had heard about him, but then all of a sudden you show up in an arena and poof, this thing happens, or and I can only imagine at that stage of life, like seeing and experiencing that, the motivation, and I've never met Chuck Grillo. When you look at his life's work, I mean, you don't do that unless you're insanely passionate about the game. I can only imagine as a young person that combination of seeing your older brother play in that environment and then being exposed to somebody that kind of gives you permission to say, hey, like just jump into the deep end, both feet, like let's go. That must have been incredibly impactful.
You nailed it. Those two things. I mean, that first game I watched, Chris Chelios was on the ice, Pat Flatley was on the ice. As I mentioned, Tony was still in prep school but headed there. And then to combine that with the resource that and passion of Chuck Grillo, um, two major impacts at a very young age for me. And probably from that point on, I can, I've said lots, and I don't think I've worked a day in my life. I've just done I've been able to do what I'm passionate about. I was passionate about playing, and then knew I wanted to get into coaching, probably because working those camps, I enjoyed that. And talking coaching even when I was playing, and then that back to the VCR thing. So I've been very, very fortunate, very lucky to be around people like that, and that's absolutely made me who I am.
So the Granatos are sometimes sort of compared to the Sutters, who come from Viking, Alberta, and are sort of kind of the first family of hockey in Canada. Granted, Viking, Alberta, when you look at it on a map, it's not hard to imagine hockey players coming from that part of the world. Maybe not so much Downers Grove. Like I don't, I don't believe that there would have been examples from your hometown of kids that had gone on to make it. You guys sort of set that precedence, but you know, um, I never clued into this until doing the research. Like, um, yourself, Tony, like three brothers are all the captains of Wisconsin, which just that in itself is remarkable. Cammie's the first woman ever elected to the NHL Hall of Fame. you know, uh, Grit seems to kind of be a part of the Granato DNA. How much of that family's grit was, a product of surviving the wrestling matches in the Granato basement and coming
Well,
out of that environment?
before you even went that direction, that was absolutely what was going through my mind. Was I think anybody that grows up and you have five siblings around you, six kids, you're probably going to have some grit that you don't even know about. Because you literally fight for everything. You
Like
fight
probably the last
for,
chicken
yeah,
leg, like everything.
fight for the salt check, the shaker on the table. I mean, you're fighting for the car, the seat in the van that you want. Every single thing you're fighting for it. And what you learn, and for me, I'm lucky to have an older brother, because you learn, okay, what's worth fighting for, because you're probably going to take a beating to get it. Is the thing. So, I had to, if I wanted to play hockey, I had to go through him, which means you were gonna, if you went in the basement, you played, and you played because you enjoyed playing. If you tried to win, and you did, you'd take a bigger beating, and that's just the way it is growing up with an older brother. And fortunately, he loved the game of hockey. I loved the game of hockey. We had a younger brother that did as well, and obviously Cammy. So it was four of us, and we battled. We battled a lot of times. And Cammy had no idea how tough she was. I can remember playing in the basement, and we'd run over her, and she's 7 years younger than Tony. So it was her and Tony on one
Oh
team,
wow,
myself and Robbie, who's two
Robbie,
years
yeah.
younger than me, on the other team. And we played 2-on-2 in the basement all the time, or the yard, or the garage, whatever. But the basement was funny because I can't tell you how many times we'd run right over Cammy, and she'd go running up the stairs crying. and we'd have to grab her by the ankle before she got to the door. There was a door at the top of the stairs.
Yeah.
You can't go upstairs crying because mom will tell us to stop playing. So we drag her back down, calm her down, and she'd start playing again. And yeah, so grit is a massive part, I think, of any, whatever you decide to do in life, you're going to need grit if you want to do it. I don't care
Yeah.
how talented you are. There's tons of millions of talented people with great ideas sitting at home right now saying, I could have done that, I should have done that, or I have this great idea. It's you need the grit to do it. And I always say this: my parents did an incredible job, and I think they did it intuitively. They didn't give us everything we wanted or everything they could actually give us, but they figured out what we were passionate about. They observed us as kids, and four out of the six of us loved hockey, and they would do anything for us because they knew we loved them. But it wasn't you get whatever you want. It was I will support you because you're showing me that you're passionate about it, and we weren't conscious of that as kids. We didn't know that dynamic was going on. I'm not so sure my parents knew that dynamic was going on, but later in life, it was easy to realize and see that. And so,
Yeah.
I even look at players, and obviously having extreme talent at the national team program. Before we even picked that team, I challenged our scouts. You know, you're going to evaluate, and you're going to say, okay, the skill level is here to here from player to player.
Yeah.
Don't pick a guy because his skill level is just 5% bigger and say, okay, oh, we just identified the most skilled players and that's why we picked them. I want everybody in the ballpark of in the range of everybody's 20% equal.
Yeah.
Either way, 20% bracket of, this guy may have 10% more skill than this guy. And then tell me who's the most passionate about playing and grinding it out.
Yeah.
Those are the players we're selecting,
Yeah.
because those are the players that will fight to develop, and they all need development. So you see at the national team program players that they're gifted and talented, but they're just not passionate about being a hockey player. And there's a lot of players, believe me, drafted in the NHL that fit that category.
Yeah.
They're good at hockey. They don't know what else to do. So of course,
Yeah.
an NHL team drafted me, and now they're going to offer me a contract. Of course, I'm going to go do it and play, and I'll sign another one and play in the minors because I don't know what I want to do yet.
So I sense, that appreciation for the players that ultimately make up the best team might be rooted in this question. What role did the question "So you think you have it bad" play in shaping your outlook of team building and development?
That was about that was one of those impact statements in life that
Yeah,
just
I bet.
stop you in your tracks. And I mean, that comment came from my father every
Yeah,
now and then. It didn't have to come a lot, but it was a situation where maybe we were as a kid emotionally out of control, exhibiting spoiled brat behavior, um, and not understanding how good we actually had it in life in any particular moment. And you'd be, I don't know, maybe throwing a fit or a tantrum or feeling like something unjust happened to you. And my dad would look at you and say, just pause and say, so you think you have it bad? And like I said, it would stop you in your tracks. And yeah, and you'd recount all the good, some of the good things you had. You couldn't recount all of the good things. And it just it's one of those statements that humbles you right away and gives you a real grounding life perspective that I think is healthy.
before you go to Wisconsin, you play for Madison in the USHL, and I again, it's so fun, going back and digging into all these things. But you played with Paul Caufield, Cole's dad,
I
who looked like
did,
he
yeah.
was a prolific scorer as well. I'd be curious to know, like, did you? I think it's fascinating with when world class players come from situations that maybe wouldn't have like the obvious environment to produce world class players. I mean, Wisconsin, great hockey program, not necessarily a hockey hotbed. Um, can you maybe share a little bit about just Paul, his passion? Because I believe, did he not run a rink, or he was? I mean, he. My understanding, I mean, he was deeply passionate about the game as well.
Yeah, and Paul's dad played for the Milwaukee Admirals. So Paul's
Oh, no
dad,
way. Okay.
I believe, is Canadian. Came played for the Milwaukee Admirals and then stayed in
No kidding.
Milwaukee. Paul was, as you mentioned, prolific goal scorer. I mean,
Yeah, huge numbers.
he just amazing goal scorer. He wasn't. If there was any knock against him, and there had to be a knock against him because he played Division II hockey, and I say a knock against him by Division I coaches, it was they didn't think he had enough speed. But and so they were worried about his speed, which I could tell you there was no like Paul. Paul easily should have played Division I hockey, and he would have scored at the Division I level. He just would have, but he was never given that opportunity. And the guy that recruited him with passion, and he had an amazing, career, uh, college career at Stevens Point, and scored a ton there. So, yes, Paul Caufield, Cole's father, extremely passionate about the game as a kid, ran a rink and was instrumental in obviously influencing Cole's career and his ability to score goals. There's a lot genetic there, but I'm sure there's a lot of teaching that Paul did as well. And it's nice to see because I felt honestly Paul deserved better when we were on the USHL team. I thought for sure he, to me, everybody should have been offering him a scholarship, and that wasn't the case for whatever
Clearly,
reason.
the apple hasn't rolled far from the tree. Um, how did the experience of playing for Jeff Sauer, winning a national championship at Wisconsin, impact you in the coach or leader you are today?
Yeah, I didn't know it at the time. I mean, there were things I would get frustrated with Coach. Sometimes I thought he wasn't, intense enough, fiery enough, whatever. And as a young guy, I was, I had to control my energy and temper at times and things like that. But what I did realize as I matured was how balanced Coach Sauer was, and how tactfully he was composed. And what I mean by that, I'll give you a bigger picture. If you win a championship, and I've been fortunate to be part of lots of different championship teams, coaching, playing, and then obviously the ones you're steps away where you read about or follow. And it seems there's a couple of unique characteristics with championship teams. One is they have a mystique. There's a mystique that of this team, whether it's a baseball team, a Major League Baseball team that wins a championship. There's a mystique, or a NBA champion, or the NHL Cup winner. There's a mystique
Sure.
to the Florida Panthers.
Yeah.
And prior to that mystique, there was a synergy that was developed. You have just this synergy that's happening, and you feel it, and the locker room feels it, the team feels it. And so when I later in life could reflect on Jeff Sauer, he he didn't overcoach. Sometimes you wondered if he was undercoaching, giving too much freedom and rope. But really what he was doing was he was allowing a synergy to take place where he was handing
Yeah.
off a lot of responsibility to the team and the members where they could develop a synergy. He wasn't such an authority figure that it was all his and only his stamp on it. So he allowed the team to develop a synergy and then a mystique. And if he had a team full of guys that were, lack of a better term, delinquents, it probably he probably didn't supply enough structure to keep them in line. But if you had a team that actually could provide a little bit of their own self discipline, they probably were one of the best in the nation. And that was the case when I was there. My 4 years there, I felt we could have won a national championship. We had more talented team the year before we won it. We had Cujo, Curtis Joseph in net,
Oh,
and we had
yeah.
Paul Stanton, who won 2 Stanley Cups with Pittsburgh, on the
Yeah.
team that year. Those were the only two. We lost 3 players that year. Those were 2 of the 3 we lost. We returned everybody else and won a national championship. So
No kidding.
we just couldn't get out of our own way the year before. And I remember the next year we learned as players how to cooperate better. Where okay, if coach designates me as a third line player, then just shut up and be a third line player. Just don't complain on the bench if you know because we used to we had a rule, you couldn't yell and ask the coach who's up next. because most of the times a coach's reflex is you're up next, and that would piss
Interesting.
everybody else off. That would piss everybody else off on the bench.
Yeah.
So we actually, talked about stuff like that as groups of, players, as a whole group, as a team, in a players meeting, and little things like that. We said, we have a good thing going here, and coaches put us in a position to succeed, but we're getting in our own way. And he enabled us to realize those things and to grow and to mature, and handed those areas off to us. And if you think about Stanley Cup winners, you hear about this all the time. The team takes over for the coach. The team basically says, "Coach, we're good now. We got it. Minimize what you do coaching now. We got it." And so the coach gets the team to that point, and then the team takes over. And that's evident in great hockey teams.
And is part of I guess the maturation of a coach is knowing, you know, observing that and knowing when to step out of the way.
You're always, as a coach, in my estimation, trying to step out of the way,
Yeah.
trying to coach less. Like I love coaching. My number one objective is to coach as little as I possibly have to.
Yeah.
So again, what is the situation? That's the context. If I have a really, really young team, I'm probably going to have to coach. If I have if I have a really, really experienced team, I probably have to coach less. I look at, Jimmy Montgomery with the Boston Bruins the last 3 years. 3 years ago, he had Krejci, Bergeron, a Marchand 3 years younger, and a healthy, deep team. Now this year, he loses his job 15 games into the year, and you saw all the coaching he had to do. Like visually, you could see it. He didn't have to do that much coaching 3 years ago. So he was in a way better position when he didn't have to coach. You had more talent, and you could let the talent run and take over. So again, my approach and my experience is you want to coach less. Unfortunately, when you lack skill and experience, you're forced to coach more. And that's a tricky one, especially at the NHL level. And I learned a lot of that also from Joel Quenneville, who I thought mastered that. Joel would err on undercoaching rather than overcoaching. And so if you gave Joel talent, the more talent you gave him, the better coach he became. He could handle it. It wasn't pressure to him. It was, and he's proven that over the years.
Absolutely.
And I think John Cooper's amazing at that too. You know,
Yeah, great example. But I think that's yeah, as you say, like under coaching, I don't think the message there is like you just take your hands off the wheel. It's maybe you do a little less with more, and you let you kind of put the puzzle pieces on the table and let the players figure out how to put it all together. You play a couple years in the minors, you get an opportunity in the USHL first with Madison, and then you go to Green Bay, and gosh, I'm doing the math here. I mean, you're in your mid-20s. You lead Green Bay to two back-to-back regular season championships. Um, what did you figure out early about coaching, and in hindsight, what might have been some of the gaps that you still needed to fill at that stage?
well, I learned a lot back to what you'd said. I worked 4 or 5 years summers at that Minnesota hockey camps as a counselor and then a coach while I was playing. And I ran my own youth hockey camps, so I learned some about coaching that, technically teaching, I should say. I learned about teaching at that point, skill development. So when I took over Green Bay, I had a great relationship with the owner. We were, the league really handcuffed us. Even though we were an expansion team, they had us drafting no expansion draft and drafting last in the regular draft. So I said to the owner, I said, well, the way they set it up, they don't want us to have success early because the league is dominant by older players. And we don't have access to any older players. There's no expansion draft. So the only ones we're going to get are guys cut from another team that come in with possibly a negative attitude because they were promised something 2 years prior and
Yeah.
it didn't come to fruition. Now they're cut. So I said, I really advise against taking on players like that. Let's just take all young players. we can control the narrative, the mindset, and then really start working with them, we're probably going to take our lumps.
Yeah.
And we did. We were 9. So we took all rookies. We were 9-38 in whatever ties we had. I remember
Long
that
season.
that record. I will never forget. We were
I
nine and
bet.
38. And the only reason I remember the next season how many wins we had is because it was we put it on our rings when we won the championship, and it was 51. So we went from
Wow.
9 wins to 51 wins. And I remember knowing enough. I was ready to coach and knew I wanted to coach for years before I took that job. And I left playing, which I didn't want to leave. I was going to go back and play a third year in the ECHL, where obviously the writing's on the wall. And I was offered this job to start Green Bay as an expansion team. The owner, I didn't know him, but I had his 2 boys in summer camp that I ran, my own hockey camp for 2
No
years
way.
before. So he called me out of the blue and said, "You don't know me, but you've had my boys in your camp the last couple summers. I'm buying this team in Green Bay. Can I talk to you about it?"
Come on.
Then a month later, he offered me the job,
How old were you?
GM coach, 23, 24,
Unreal.
and never
Amazing.
coached, never was a GM. I had just was going back to the ECHL, and at the time to play a third year. And my buddy was coaching, so I was skating with the Madison Capitals USHL team to stay in shape. Their coach resigned. Their coach resigned 15 games into the year. I'm literally finishing a degree that I'm going to get done in late November and go join the team in the ECHL. So I'm staying in shape skating with the USHL team. The owner flies in and says, "You have to coach this team. The kids are going to leave. The coach just walked out." I said, "I'll coach it for 2 weeks. I'm going back to my final exam is in 2 weeks. I'm back in the East Coast League playing."
What
So
a
in that
crazy
two
story.
weeks, that owner of Green Bay watched that team because he lived in Madison, watched the Capitals, and he called me out of the blue and said, "Hey, I'm watching you coach the Capitals. Can you help me with Green Bay? I'm getting it." So back to the Green Bay, we had them as an expansion franchise. We took all young guys. We took a beating, similar to coaching the U17s at the NTDP. But then we won the next 2 championships the next 2 years. And so I was, fortunate, lucky, whatever. But we had a plan in place, and I saw it work.
Yeah.
I saw how a team can evolve and develop, within a year or two, and that really helped my career. So I was very fortunate to have that early opportunity. And then again, it was a laboratory, really. I could experiment because we were an expansion team. No one expected us to win. It's a lot
Yeah.
harder when you're expected to win because you can't experiment much and you can't tweak things much because expectations put you in a different situation.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll say this in all the time we've been doing this podcast, and we've heard a lot of, folks coaching journeys. I can't recall anybody that's maybe had more interventions from the universe or nudges to get into coaching. Like it seemed like this was an unavoidable fate that you were gonna be a teacher of the game. You go back as a coach to the ECHL. You end up in Peoria. You win a championship there. Granted, I don't know if the East Coast League was at that time was what it was in say like the late 80s, early 90s, where I think it was you were literally in the trenches every night. But it was probably still a lot more truculent than it is today. You don't strike me as the coach that gravitates towards that. You seem to be more of a teacher and somebody that maybe relies on skill and making plays. Um, how did what did you learn between Green Bay and that championship, and how did you approach, um, you know, bringing a team together?
Well, coaching at that time, you mentioned it's a different era, totally
Yeah,
different era. And it was good for me. I was ready to get out of Green Bay. I was offered the job, and not because I didn't love Green Bay, but I felt we'd won twice in 3 years. I want to coach at the highest level. I got to move on. Like, what more can I do here? Even though I loved everything about Green Bay, I need another challenge, and it was every bit of the challenge I needed because I walk in the locker room in Columbus, my first ECHL head coaching position. I'm the coach and GM. The coach left late August, and And I remember calling our owner saying, they offered me this job. They had offered it, like I said, the year before, and I wanted to try to win back to back. So I turned down that offer, went back to Green Bay, and then now fast forward, I call our owner. He approves that I can leave Green Bay and take this job. Not a single player was re-signed for the team in Columbus in ECHL. I'm the coach and I'm the GM. I've got to re-sign everybody, and the average pay is like $400 a week. So all of these players don't know me. I get on the phone and say, "Hey, I'm your new coach. You don't know me. Here's the offer I make to you to come back and play, $410 a week." None of them liked it because they won the division. They didn't win in the playoffs, but they won the regular season divisional title. And they all thought they should get more. Rightly so. They did well. But there was no more money to get.
Yeah.
They all wanted to come back. So I had to sign all these guys. So on day one, I walk in the locker room, nobody trusted me
Yeah.
because they all felt I gave them a low contract. That was one hell of a challenge as a head coach.
I bet.
And what an experience to walk in your own locker room and just feel the energy that, they're not really trustworthy of you because I don't know who they are as players. I don't know their skill sets. I don't know what they did. And they want to be appreciated for what they did in winning the division the last year. So really challenging first year. We were okay. We finished above 500. We made the playoffs, but we were, it wasn't good enough. Period. The next year, and it did gradual, day by day. I mean, it's gradual. They're again, you're dealing with their perception, not reality. Their perception is I'm an untrustworthy guy, right? That was the reality is I get they might not know to trust me, but their perception is I'm untrustworthy. So I'm dealing with that perception. So eventually you win that over, as they get to know you. And the next year we won the division again, my second year. And then the Columbus Blue Jackets came in, so I was out of a job. And fortunately, yeah, fortunately, I there was 11 vacancies in the ECHL that summer. I had gone I was on I was an alternate governor for the team, so I'd go to owners meetings. So I got to see how all the owners interacted at owners meetings. And with the 11 vacancies, I thought, man, there's only 3 or 4 jobs I can apply for here. Like I don't trust those 6 or 7 owners to even apply for those jobs. This is my career. I can't make a mistake. I need to win. So I was really lucky that the Peoria job opened. I loved those owners. And I got that job and we won the championship. And St. Louis hired me as the head coach in the American Hockey League the next year. But I remember all of those dynamics going on, where I can't apply for 7 of these 11 jobs that are opening up. These are the only ones I can apply for. The only ones I know that I can win in. And again, I went to Peoria. The support of the ownership was amazing, and we won the championship. So,
Um, the things they don't put in the coaching manual, right? Like just the human side of the job and the business. When you go to Worcester, my math, you're 33 years old. And not that you weren't dealing with men in the East Coast Hockey League, but I sense that in the American League, you're starting to deal with players that are making real money. They're paying a mortgage. They might have kids. Like it's legitimately a job now. It's not a placeholder to something else. Did you ever get imposter syndrome or have to maybe wrestle with just that next tier of the level you were coaching?
you did. You definitely, there was nerve wracking, very nerve. One thing I do remember, and it was one of the very first games I coached. I had a great general manager in Larry Plow. I mean, just a phenomenal person, uh, role model, leader. And I remember standing on the bench in the Worcester Centrum and thinking, now I work. It was my first 6 years of coaching were the 3 in the USHL and 3 in the ECHL. I was a general manager and a head coach. I felt it's way easier to win when you're the general manager and head coach. if you don't like a player, you get rid of him. You don't have to talk your general manager into it, and your rear end, your ass is on the line as a GM for the performance. It just made everything cleaner and easier, and I felt it was an advantage. And we won 3 championships. So now it's the first job I have where I'm not the general manager, not in charge of the players, and somebody else picks them, and somebody else says this is how we should develop them, and this is how we should use them, and this is their identity and their role. This is how we, fast we should move them along or not. So it was different for me, and it was nerve wracking to start. And I remember on the bench thinking, what would Larry Plow want in this situation in
Yeah.
the middle of the game?
Yeah.
And my competitive juices just went through the roof. And
Yeah.
I thought, what am I freaking thinking of? Just drop that thought and make decisions for yourself.
Yeah.
Larry will tell you after the game what he wants to tell you.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there was a very short window there that I remember that
I bet.
without question. Now, that team, worth noting on that team, when I made that jump to the American Hockey League as an ECHL coach, hadn't played in the NHL. Larry Plow was great to me. John Ferguson was the general manager of Worcester and assistant general manager in St. Louis. And on our team, we had Pascal Rayom, who played a lot in the NHL, and Dwayne Rollison. Those two guys, and Dwayne Rollison specifically, helped me immensely in the transition.
So, Donnie, you go from Worcester, you get an opportunity in the NHL as an assistant coach for one season with the Blues. You become a scout with the Toronto Maple Leafs, and we've touched on your time with the US NTDP program. I'd be curious. You make your way back to the NHL with Chicago, and eventually become the head coach in Buffalo. What do you miss more, standing behind an NHL bench or running an NHL practice?
Absolutely standing behind the bench. I mean, I love practicing, but there's nothing like when you walk to the bench before an NHL game. You don't know what the outcome is going to be. Certainly with the team we had, because we were one of the youngest teams in the NHL, if not the youngest. All 3 years I had the Sabres.
Yeah.
So it's not like you're coaching the Vegas Knights where you already got a sneak peek of what is highly likely to happen in that game.
Yeah.
Um, the top 5, 10 teams know you can strong arm your opponent. But for us, you walk to that bench and you worked, in your practice and your meetings, and you're undermanned compared to your opponent. It's the way it is. You're a developing, evolving franchise, but you get to see, okay, what worked? Where are we at? Do we have energy tonight? Can we play with passion and pace? And it's an unknown, and so that really is exciting. Like I said, it's a surge of adrenaline, and then the in-game tactics. It might not look like you do much. You're kind of cognizant in the NHL when cameras go on you and when they're off you.
Yeah.
And I like to do more coaching when the camera's not on you.
Yeah.
I'll talk to a guy right as the puck's being dropped because I know the camera goes to rather
Interesting.
than
Yeah.
have, especially in Buffalo, I felt it was important, no disrespect for our media whatsoever, but I don't need them to see me coaching, and I don't need them to see, to know everything I'm coaching our team, because then they're going to evaluate us on that and bring it to life and put more pressure on it. For example, last year we improved immensely in our defensive numbers and goals against. But here in the media, I never said anything about that as being targeting that and working on that, just so they wouldn't talk about it every day. So we could actually improve it without it becoming a focal point of the media and everybody else. Because then you have one bad game in there and it blows up on you. So yeah, so I like the in game and the little tactical things you can do in game, and watching it from the bench level, knowing you laid out 3 or 4 key points and which ones you have to bring to their attention, shift in and shift out, or adjustments you're going to make in between periods. That's a blast.
I think it's such a great point about just controlling that, that narrative. I sense that if you needed a PhD to coach in the NHL, one of the courses you would need to take during that PhD would be on, one would probably be on managing up. And another would probably be on just controlling the narrative and just being mindful when you're in front of the microphone, et cetera. And I sense that's because there isn't a PhD. The only way to learn that is to go through it, and probably a big reason why a lot of NHL coaches are maybe more successful their second time around is because they just, it's like anything else. You need reps. Um, your second full season in Buffalo, you finish 1 point back of the final playoff spot. Your third season, you finish +2 in goal differential. The Washington Capitals nabbed the last playoff spot with a -37 goal differential. I don't know what to make of those two stats exactly, other than it would scream that the margins in the National Hockey League are razor thin. The difference between winning and losing. What are maybe some of those margins or areas where? What are the differences or difference
Psyche
makers?
for sure. I mean, psyche. Their Washington psyche could handle being -37 and not fearing they're going to miss the playoffs.
Yeah,
We would lose one game in fear that, oh my God, we're going to miss the playoffs, and it's game 53 or something. And I'm exaggerating, right? So just
yeah,
I'm saying this to exaggerate the point, just to see, you know, separation. Maybe we were closer to Washington, but just to,
yeah.
for purposes of that, Washington was comfortable. They knew the objective is to win more games. Maybe their experience on the ice and whatever, they didn't panic and didn't whatever, and they handled that and said, we can be not -37 and get a playoff spot. I think what we were challenged with last year, we had a season prior that you mentioned, we were 1 point away from a playoff spot. So everybody thought it was a good season. The next season, or the season we're speaking of, then we felt more vulnerable, and it had to be perfect. And we began identifying with our vulnerabilities or how we might lose a game, and less with how we're going to win a game or our assets or our strengths. And that's what elevated expectations and pressure of elevated expectations does to teams. Now at the highest level, I'll give you an example of the psyche at the highest level. You know, Tampa Bay 5 or 6 years ago rattles off one of the best regular seasons in NHL history. What happened? They elevated expectations. They're going to win the cup. There's more pressure because of elevated expectations. They literally lose the first four playoff games and are swept
Columbus, yeah.
by Columbus. And so you see lots of time, and then because of that, now they had to go through that, and then they win two Stanley Cups the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Vegas, the year before they won the Stanley Cup, what happened to them? They didn't even make the playoffs.
Yeah.
They had an
Such a
unbelievable
such a
roster.
great point.
So the psyche, the expectations were the Vegas Knights, and they couldn't get out of their own way. And Colorado, how many times were they thought they could win a cup before they actually won a cup? And then they win it. So it's like you have to go through the experience of heightened expectations and the pressure that comes with it. And for us, that was last year. We should have gained the experience of it last year, and chalked it up as, okay, what part of this is utter disappointment, and what part of this is actually, this is the situation that happens. We're
It's
going to
the
have to
journey.
grow
It's
from.
part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we didn't look at it that second option, and I think that's, that can sometimes not be good. Evident that Washington wasn't worried about being -37 and losing by 4 goals on a certain night.
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned the psyche too, because just as you say that, I wonder too, like what effect on the psyche does playing in front of a fan base that can point to winning the Stanley Cup within the last 5 years versus going a decade without getting into the playoffs, and how much that, as much as they're supposed to be professional athletes and that shouldn't affect them, these are human beings. I don't see how that doesn't affect you, or you at least don't bring that to the rink to some extent. Don, we've gone into overtime with you, which is hugely appreciated. As we close here, and standing offer to come back and talk hockey anytime you want, because this has been fantastic. You mentioned you're a reader. Um, what's on your nightstand currently, and any recommended reading for the coaches listening?
Ooh, I mean, lots of different books. I'm looking at my shelf here for a second. Well, one of my shelves, but group think. Pick out some books on the topic of group think, because I think that I really feel that is, um, something that's entering coaching more and more, and you're challenged by it more and more as a coach. So you need to pick up the cues on it and the skills, I think, to navigate through that. So I've over the last few years, I've found that topic within entering our coaching more and more, and that's basically social influences of the athletes on the athletes we're coaching. But we're in a new generation coming into the NHL, and what I mean by coming into the NHL, the 26 and 27-year-old guy, and there's a great book that's titled "The Anxious Generation," and
Jonathan
that's
Haidt.
what I
Yeah.
would recommend. And in
Yeah.
that book, what you see is there is a distinct line of birth year, a person born in a certain year, before it and after it are like black and white when it comes to dealing with them and mental health
Yeah.
and obviously life and how they perceive and think and feel. And the birth year that he used in the book was it surrounded the advent of the iPhone and really social media use on the iPhone and the front facing camera on the iPhone. So the author reasoned, and he backed it up with tons of research that, and you know this if you read the book, obviously,
Yeah.
that
It's phenomenal.
when you could take selfies and then put them on social media and somebody else could rip on you, it was a big hit to your self esteem. And so kids have now grown up on this. It was never there. We never used social media as kids. The 28-year-old, 29-year-old in the NHL never took that hit as a 13-year-old. Everybody born after him took that hit and is shell shocked because of it. So they have their self-esteem is challenged greater and faster. They need more support and positive feedback than the person. And the date, I think the year you talked about was 1995. Those born before and those born after. And you can see where that is happening in the NHL. The 95 borns are what, 20, entering 30 years old now. So every player younger than that, as a whole, you're coaching a different athlete.
There was an article that came out in the Athletic recently about how like the prevalence of video games in the NHL now, and how that's kind of taken the place of like going out and drinking and team bonding. They're all wearing headsets, and we've got friends of ours here that I won't mention the player's name, but their laneway house, which looks like a cottage fit for Martha Stewart, a Canuck player rents it out. The only concern when they rented it was that they could set up a gaming station, and that's what they do. The other thing is Mike Tomlin, Pittsburgh Steelers head coach. Literally, and it's so funny you mentioned the book. I was thinking about this. He was interviewed on a podcast that I was listening to yesterday, and he talked about the importance of recognizing a player's experience. He uses the example of saying like there was a time when players did 2-a-days in the NFL and people think new players are soft because they can't do it. And he's like, they're not soft. They've just never done it. They didn't do it in college. They didn't do it in high school. Doesn't mean they can't do it. They just never did it. And as coaches, we got to recognize what's a player's experience, i.e. growing up with social media. Don, I hope you have a great rest of the day. This has been awesome. Thanks so much for spending time with us. And again, offer stands anytime you want to come back, talk hockey here at one of our events. We'd love to have you.
Thank you, guys. That was easy, Aaron, to talk hockey when you lay those questions out. You get the mind flowing. And for a guy not jumping behind the bench right now, it's great to talk hockey. So thanks for having me on.